everyone. I'm Rita Nakashima-Brock, and I want to welcome you to this webinar on the documentary PBS series, Asian Americans, and the director, or the producer and showrunner is with us to discuss it, Renee Tajima-Pena. I want to thank Volunteers of America for providing the technology and support for this webinar. I'm Senior Vice President of Volunteers of America, and so my assistant Sam and VOA are the media providers for us to have this webinar. The program was created by PANAUTUM, which is the Pacific Asian North American Asian Women in Theology Ministry Organization, which was started 35 years ago by a small group of graduate students, and it's grown into a big association of scholars and ministers and activists who are Asian American women. And we were actually planning to have a big anniversary 35th year annual meeting, because we've been meeting for 35 years. And we planned to do it in April, but of course, like a lot of other organizations, we had to cancel our event. We were very disappointed by that. So we've been having webinars instead as a way to try to stay in touch and keep thinking and moving forward in the work that we're all doing. So so I want to welcome you and also thank many of our affiliated organizations like the Asian Pacific American Research and Religions Research Initiative, the Asian North American Religion and Society Culture Group of the American Academy of Religion, and all the institutions and friends that helped spread the word about the webinar. So thanks for all that work for us. Our guest today is Renee Tajima-Pena, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. She's also director of the Center for Ethno-Communications and holder of the Alumni and Friends of Japanese American Ancestry Endowed Chair there. She is an Academy Award nominated documentary filmmaker whose credits include Who Killed Vincent Chin, My America or Honk If You Love Buddha, Calavera Highway, Skate Manzanar, Labor Women, No Mas Bebes, and other films about themes related to immigration, race, ethnicity, gender, and social justice. Her films have screened at the Cannes Film Festival, New Directors, New Films, South by Southwest Film Festival, Sundance, the Toronto International Film Festival, and the Whitney Biennial. She is the series producer, showrunner for Asian Americans, which is an unprecedented 5-hour series on the Asian American experience that just aired on PBS. And it's the topic of our conversation today. The first ever television history of its kind, Asian Americans documents crucial historical moments when we rose up to resist the forces of fear and hate and claim our place in this society. And I believe this groundbreaking series has arrived at another crucial historical time. In the current pandemic, we have seen the dramatic rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And I found myself deeply moved and heartened as I watched the series in this particular context. So we will begin with a short video about the series, and then Renee will speak to us about making it. So Sam, could you show us the video?
Implicit married an African-American woman from the neighborhood of Treme, Ella Blackman. After I wrote about Implicit and Ella in my book, I was contacted by 4th and 5th generation descendants.
To find out that we were Indian, it just intrigued us that we wanted to learn more. So we kept reaching out to Vivek, asking him, well, did you find out anything?
This isn't something that I expected. I had only seen Implicit and Ella as names within archival documents. I had never even seen photographs of them.
I can recall my grandmother telling me a story about when they were small, that her and her dad and the mother went to New York on the train, the kids, and the father was all allowed to sit up in the front of the train, but my grandmother had to sit in the back. And she said, well, it wasn't that she looked black, it was the fact that they knew she was black. And I said, well, that's odd, because, you know, some of the kids' skin complexion is darker than my grandmother's. So I thought that was really weird, but...
Moxit was darker than your grandmother.
Right. I know you've been waiting a while to see it. The cemeteries back then were segregated, so they should not have been in here, but they were buried here.
A white cemetery?
A white cemetery.
So he was known as Indian.
Yes.
And she was known as black.
Right.
And even though he was darker skinned, he was allowed to move more freely, to do more.
Whereas she wasn't.
Yeah. Breaking the color line in death.
I was 13 years old the day that my family went out on strike. I remember we were working when my father says, come on, we're leaving. I says, we're leaving, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. So we left.
To go on strike, you suffer a lot of hardship. Maybe you get hungry, maybe you're gonna lose your car, maybe you're gonna lose your house.
And I remember leaving the field and driving through seeing the strikers, or the Filipinos.
But the Filipinos face a dilemma. As they strike for a union, the farmers bring in Mexican workers to replace them.
It's one of the things I learned that farmers like to do. They like to pit the Mexicans against the Filipinos, because you're going to be fighting for the same pot of gold.
Many Mexican laborers have already joined the National Farm Workers Association, led by the charismatic Cesar Chavez.
I remember meeting at the Filipino Community Hall in Toledo. All the labor contractors were there, and a lot of the farm workers were there, and they're trying to decide, are we going to end the strike? Or are we going to negotiate with the Mexicans to join us? And then Larry Leong, he gets up and says, I'm going to go talk to the Mexicans.
When the strike happened, Cesar Chavez wasn't really quite ready. But Cesar also knew that if they didn't join Filipinos then it would never happen.
Larry approaches Cesar Chavez and his colleague Dolores Huerta, another powerful organizer.
Come on up, brothers, we are waiting for you!
As one of AWOC's co-founders, her relationship with Larry and the Filipinos goes back years.
And then a couple days later, we're at this church. They're talking about the strike. They're discussing, should we go on strike or not go on strike? And all of a sudden there's this swalga. I said, what the heck, swalga? Because I thought they were saying, hell no. I said, no, it means strike, we're going on strike. And so the Mexicans joined us.
Where are your brothers and sisters over here? Come on! Come on now! ¡Viva la causa! ¡Viva!
They take the Mexican labor movement and the Filipino labor movement, they create the United Farm Workers.
And they really pushed that the workers eat together, they have meetings together, that they were picket lines together. And it was only because of they become one union that they were able to win the strike.
Larry knew that his style was not good PR. He was aggressive. He wore his emotions on his sleeve. He needed Cesar's charisma, his ability to speak. Cesar was the spokesman.
It's going to be built by farm workers, and it's going to be for farm workers.
Whereas Larry wanted to get down and dirty. He wanted to work out in the fields.
Delano became more than a farm labor dispute. It became, in a sense, the West Coast civil rights movement for people of color. All of a sudden, people started equating what was happening in Delano to the Black civil rights movement on the East Coast in Alabama and Mississippi. You started having these politicians coming out there. You have Robert Kennedy holding hearings as to why the white growers are not going to give people of color these benefits that they're asking for. Not only are you boycotting in Delano, now you're sending groups and college students and people who believe in a labor union and equal rights to do a secondary grape strike. And now they're boycotting in New York, they're boycotting in Montreal in Canada, they're boycotting in Europe, they're boycotting California grapes.
Strike and boycott against grapes will continue.
It took 5 years to finally get the growers to sign a contract. And that was only because people went out on the boycott and they convinced people all over the United States not to eat grapes. Growers couldn't sell their products, and so they had to sign.
Larry Itliong, what do you have to say about seeing grapes at the stores after all this time?
Well, I think that it's great, and thanks to the co-op store that have been supporting the grape boycott to help bring about justice and dignity on behalf of the farm workers.
For me, that's one of my pride and joys. Yeah, Filipinos were here, and we made a difference.
Working in the fields. That's where I realized that if a lot of people put their mind to it, they can win. I left field working behind me completely, but I never left the memories of these guys.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me here today. If you're expecting me to discuss Asian American history and religion, sorry, it's not my expertise, even though I made a film called My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha, that was referring to a bumper sticker. And I come from 3 generations, actually, of Protestant ministers, but I was usually asleep. But hopefully enough by osmosis, kind of seeped into me. So I've made social justice films ever since the beginning of my career. And I attribute that to sort of the moral environment that I grew up with. So the organizers asked me to talk a little bit about the production itself and why, the how, and what we left off. So I just want to talk first about what it's about. This series is not about how Asians became American. It's really about how Asians shaped America. And it didn't take, I know I've seen posts that it took 8 years to produce it. It did not. It took almost that long to raise the money. We actually did not get the green light till 2018. So we did this in less than 18 months, which, I have to hand it to all the producers and the team involved. I mean, 18 months for 5 episodes, which are really like 20 films, because each episode has, multiple stories. That's 18 months is like slam bang. It usually takes me 5 years just to make one film. So, so we started like August 2018, but even before the pandemic, this what we've been wrestling with as a community is, this growing diversity, not only Asian American community, but in the United States, the growing diversity, yet we're more divided. And the question is, how do we move forward together as people, living within this country. And what can the Asian American story tell us? I mean, that's one thing we were really, really interested in looking at. And we wanted to, I know that from the suits at PBS and even from within our own community, I think there was an expectation that this would be what Don Young, one of our executive producers, calls like the sepia tone, kind of nostalgic look at Asian Americans, that Asian Americans were like, the Irish Americans came here, encountered adversity, and then, figured it out, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and everything's fine after that. And that's not the history we knew as a team, and that's not the history that, our humanities, our historical advisors were, really schooling us about. So we really want to look at these fault lines of race that you can trace back throughout the time Asians have been here. Race, representation, and xenophobia, also how empire shaped the Asian American experience. And we really want to see how at tipping points, at these moments in crises, especially how those fault lines erupt and how Asian Americans respond when those eruptions happen. So, returning to this question of, it's kind of the moral environment that I grew up in, but also that I think is, embedded in the series, thematically, what we want to look at is, if the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, we believe Asian Americans have been on that trajectory. And we want to see that, and we want to counter the narrative of Asian Americans as this model minority. Toni Morrison talked about, this master narrative having been written, but we didn't write it. So this was an opportunity for us to start to, not to start to write that narrative, because it's a dynamic thing. It's been written. I mean, we made this series on the shoulders of, Lonnie Ding and filmmakers who have come before us and who have explored these stories. And also, we saw this as being a jumping off point for new storytelling in the Asian American experience. So the series is really for a general audience. We actually interviewed a YA author because this was an author who had, was a real hardcore journalist. She knew how to do research, but she also knew how to talk to a general audience. And they say, like, even the New York Times, you're supposed to write for a 10th grader. In mass market television, this was not produced for a kind of a Asian American studies theoretical, graduate seminar. It was produced for people, there are 330 PBS stations. They're located, many of them in places where there are very few Asian Americans, in Indiana or South Dakota or, Vermont, all over the country. And we had to reach those viewers who we had to assume may know little or nothing about the Asian American experience. It was very difficult for me because teach Asian American studies at UCLA, which is like heaven, but it's also like a bubble within a bubble within a bubble. And I had to keep on, or, especially our executive producers had to keep on reminding me, well, you think everybody knows about the Japanese American incarceration, and actually not. And, we had like younger people who were non-Asian, who were, Latinx or white or African American, who were on our team. And, we would ask them about these different stories. Have you ever heard of this? And they would say, no, I had no idea it ever happened. So it was a real wake-up call. So because we wanted to reach a general audience, we really wanted to look at personal lives and stories, rather than more of a kind of informational overview of the history. So we were really concerned about character development, dramatic arc, visual storytelling. We also talked about our interviewees as not talking heads or interviewees, but as storytellers. Even if they were historians or experts, we looked at them as storytellers. And we didn't want narration to be narrated only from the top, only from, you know, people who are degreed or have, you know, university affiliations, who are professors, but we wanted people who either had shaped the history or were eyewitnesses to the history, or their descendants, and people who had a personal connection to the history to be among the storytellers. What we left off a lot, I mean, religion as a theme, you know, LGBTQ stories, we really kind of struggled to find those stories, and, you know, with one exception, that did not become a theme. Sports, youth culture, that's another thing we really wanted to look at, but didn't have the time for. Conventionally kind of define success stories is something that the team wasn't really interested in, but, you know, we got a lot of pressure to tell, like the, you know, business success, famous architects, inventors, that kind of thing. But we wanted to explore the full diversity of the Asian American experience. I mean, after the 1965 immigration reforms, of course, the, you know, the kind of ethnic diversity, language, cultural diversity has really just exploded. So we were going to produce 6 episodes of the series. And just to, oh, and that was all the way into when we started the production. So we opened the office, I think it was like, it was August 1st or the last week of July 2018. And our plan was to produce 6 episodes that took us to the present day. We started just with a handful of people. Eventually we had like maybe 2 or 3 dozen people on staff, full and part-time, but we started with just 4 of us to start the first research and get the production going and start, you know, making calls. And we found out that there was no money for 6 episodes, so we would have to pack everything into 5 episodes. The other thing that was a real blow is the approach of storytellers. We really wanted to have, you know, a handful of people who are central kind of storytellers who can cross different episodes, like writers or historians who, one, knew the content, knew the history, but secondly, had their own family and personal story to tell. Viet Thanh Nguyen, the writer, was one. Helen Zia was another. And the other major one was Don Mabalan, who was a Filipina historian, like just this really dynamic, young. I mean, she was relatively young for, you know, the kind of impact that she had. So the first week of August, we got Don's family's home movies. They had the Mabalan family. They're from Stockton. They have incredible home movies. You can see them also on the Internet Archive of their family in the like 1950s and 1960s. And then we got her book, and 2 of, actually the other 3 people who opened the office with me were all Asian American, UCLA Asian American Studies MA alumni, or one was a current student. Jenna Hamamoto and Yuri Chung were alumni, and so they knew Don, who also was a MA alumni from our program. And you know, in the weekend, it was like the first weekend or second weekend of August, we got this email that she had tragically died on vacation in Hawaii. And it's like, I mean, you know, I can kind of live with the loss of, you want to do 6, so you have to figure out how to do 5. But, you know, it really reminded us of the people who came before us, people like Lonnie Ding, who actually tried to do the first Asian American series, Ancestors in America, got, you know, partway through and then was never able to finish. And that was like in the 1980s, I think. You know, Yuji Ichioka and the people upon whose shoulders our work as filmmakers were really built. So we, with, you know, very little time to create the series, we just had to kind of refigure a lot of things. So, you know, in some ways we never recovered. So there's a lot that's missing, of course. When you cut off like the last 15, 20 years of Asian American history, you really cut out like all these great stories that, you know, like I wanted to do the El Monte human trafficking story, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, you know, was really seminal and really did important work in these garment workers who were basically enslaved in El Monte. There are these Nepali taxi drivers who were involved with the Taxi Workers Alliance in New York, and, you know, were really getting hit by the gig economy and the you know, they had expensive taxi medallions and they were getting hit by the rise of Uber and Lyft. And so there were a lot of stories that, you know, we couldn't tell. And we had to make, some stories got really contracted. The 1980s, you know, anti-Asian violence, like today, was really resurgent. And I did not want to revisit the story of Vincent Chin, which was, you know, a real landmark event for Asian Americans. You know, I made the film. I was uncomfortable that Asian Americans kept on invoking his story in kind of a frame of grievance. And, you know, when we were seeing the, like, Ahmaud Arbery's happening every day in Black and brown communities. So I thought that, you know, it's a story that's been told, but, you know, you can't tell it unless you kind of think about, you know, what the deeper meaning is for today. There was a story I thought was, you know, much more important to me in Stockton again, and I was interested in Stockton as a place, as you can tell from Don's story. In Stockton, you know, in 1989, Patrick Purdy, who had these white supremacist kind of ideas, you know, went to a Cleveland elementary school and shot up the school and killed, you know, a bunch of little kids, all Southeast Asian kids, Cambodian, Vietnamese. And, you know, I found this great character who was a little boy at that time, but his father was the priest at the local temple, and but this guy had gone through this just really inspiring kind of transformation, and, you know, now works with youth, and you know, it's like, in a lot of ways, this was a collaboration, and it was just, you know, people on the team really felt that you had to tell the Vincent Chin story. I thought maybe we can tell both stories, but, you know, in 1 hour, when you have to cover so much ground, you can, you know, we just had to drop it. I mean, I even went to Stockton and shot some footage up there. And so, you know, but as I said, it's, you know, we stand on the shoulders of films that have come before us. There are a lot of great films out there about the Asian American experience. You can see them now, you know, online free for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And baked into this series and the work we do is the mentorship and and pushing new storytellers and stories. All of us on the team, producers, Grace Lee, Leo Chang, Gita Ganber, Jean Chen, Don Young, you know, a lot of us are have been involved in the formation of ADOC, the Asian American Documentary Network. And right now you can see online Asian COVID stories. And these are all young emerging filmmakers who have made short films about, you know, this moment. a Hmong filmmaker, South Asian filmmaker, trans filmmaker, and we have others coming up. So, so I encourage you to watch that. So that's it. I look forward to comments from the panelists, and I can talk more about the stories and the history and the series in response to panel comments.
So thank you, Renee. As Renee said, we're going to have a few responses from panelists. And then we will, Christine Pei is our chat moderator. Christine's a professor at Denison University in feminist ethics. And she is going to sort of pay attention to the chat and pull up some things that she thinks are questions that would be good to extend the conversation. And then our panelists who will speak next, there are 3 of them, and Christine and all of our panelists are members of Pan Autumn and have been with the organization quite a long time. So we're really pleased that they were willing to be the panel for this event. Dr. Rachel Boondang is a Catholic feminist ethicist based in the Bay Area. She teaches religious studies at Sacred Heart Cathedral in San Francisco and ethics at Santa Clara University's graduate program for pastoral ministries. Her research explores the intersections of race, religion, and feminism with special attention to Philam religiosity. And then Dr. Jane Iwamura is director of the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism and professor of religious studies at University of the West in Los Angeles. Her research focuses on Asian American religions, race, and popular culture in the United States, with an emphasis on visual culture. Her publications include Virtual Orientalism, Religion and Popular Culture in the US, and the co-edited volume, Revealing the Sacred in Asian and Pacific America. She has also written on Japanese American lived religions, as well as on the intersection of religion and Asian American literary production. She's the co-founder and steering committee member of the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative. And our 3rd panelist is Dr. Helen Jin Kim, who studies US history and religion. She is co-author of Family Sacrifices and the author of a forthcoming book, Sacred Allies, supported by the Louisville Institute and National Endowment for the Humanities. She is the first Asian American woman and faculty member of Korean descent at the Candler School of Theology at Emory, where she was recently awarded the Provost Teaching Award for Excellence in Graduate and Professional Education and the On Wings of Excellence in Teaching Award. And she completed her BA and MDiv, BA at Stanford and MDiv and PhD at Harvard. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rachel, who will be our first panelist. It's all yours, Rachel.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. I will begin by saying that the comments I'm going to give this afternoon, I'm going to skip over some of the things that Renee had previously mentioned because, but touch on them a little bit later to kind of pick them up. And then also the things, my comments also revolve around conversations I've been having with Philam educators and ministers over the last week as we've been watching it together. So the first thing I want to talk about is, the tension between othering and belonging that shows up in the film, and not just between Asian folk and Anglo folk, but also with other racial and ethnic minorities and among different Asian American groups. So if you look at the legal cases that the film highlights, for example, we're equating whiteness with Americanness, or at least the possibility of Americanness. And that poses the question, are we doomed to never belong, no matter how many generations our families have been here, no matter how well we speak English, no matter how intermarried and multiracial we end up becoming, and no matter what our contributions and accomplishments have been, whether you're talking about labor or military service or medical service in this present moment. And to me, it was interesting to see the Philam story begin with the Igorot village in 1904 at the World's Fair, just as the US recolonizes the Philippines. So yes, you already have anti-Chinese stereotypes already taking root, But for me, my first thought, and I'm not ashamed to admit this, is, you know, wow, is this where we got cast as jungle Asian rather than fancy Asian, right? So, you know, why start there? Why not start, for example, with the Manila Men in Louisiana, or the Morro Bay Landing, both in the 1500s? And we see that tension between othering and belonging also when other Asians try to distinguish themselves from Japanese in the 1940s and the 1970s. And then again, when you have Muslim identity being swallowed up into everything brown and South Asian or Middle Eastern during the 2000s. So second thing is the muted and implicit nature of the religious threads in this film. Whether I'm talking Catholic or Protestant or Indigenous or Muslim, I cannot imagine making sense of Philam experience without it. And to me, religion was most evident in the sequences telling South Asian stories after 9/11, and then also in the cemetery sequences. And personally for me as a Catholic, you know, that adds another layer of international and transnational and interethnic belonging. So for example, if you look at the stories of the farm workers, particularly from Latinx perspectives, they'll often include something about the religious dimensions in exploring migrant life and the pursuit of social justice. So how might we bring a stronger attention and greater attention to something like that? Third thing, you've mentioned colonization and empire, and that is something that we also had hoped for further development. Fourth thing, given the multiple identities with what Asian Pacific American encompasses, you know, you're trying to weave together a story that still has a lot of loose threads and drop stitches, and I appreciate that. And it's a huge, daunting undertaking, and we're really grateful that you and your team have done it. I will say, you know, one of the things that I had expected to see and did not see was the Miss Saigon protests in the 90s, I think it was, you know, when about casting Jonathan Pryce, and then Asian American actors and artists, you know, protesting in that wake. My last comment for the moment is pedagogical uses, and you had mentioned you're not trying to do a typical Asian American history that might get used in the course, but I still think, you know, because many of us are educators out there, what purposes might it serve in our classrooms and in our communities? How do we imagine sharing the story and unpacking it and inspiring future generations? So thank you.
Thank you. Jane.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to have this opportunity today to speak with Renee. I think the last time I saw you, I was responding to a panel about My America and Honk If You Love Buddha. But it's great to be here to talk with all of you about Asian Americans. I'm going to read what I wrote because I don't want to go off track, and I want to make sure that everybody has time for questions for Renee. So here I go. Film, I believe it's, you know, when Asian Americans came out, I said, oh, it's about time. Film is an especially effective and affecting medium that I found indispensable in the classroom. I'm sure many of you have as well, and more broadly in the public arena. So as an Asian American studies educator, I had been relying on Lonnie Ding's masterful documentary, Ancestors in America. And they have that coming out in 2001. But I always had to supplement because you're right, Lonnie could not make anything after episode 3, I believe. So even though it was my go-to, I always had to supplement in piecemeal fashion with film and articles about even the emergence of the model minority myth, the LA uprisings, the sovereignty movements, the Vietnam War and refugee experience, 9/11, all of that. And kind of craft the narrative I wanted to convey to my students. So Asian Americans covers much of this territory and weaves the sometimes seemingly disparate pieces together into a beautifully patterned whole. So thank you, Renee. it makes teaching much easier for me. I appreciate that. I also appreciate too, I should give a shout out. I really, I was thankful to see Lonnie's image in the credits. I noticed that was one of the first ones there. So that was wonderful. So today we have a chance to view the series through the lens of religion. For my colleagues and friends here today, this perspective is often fraught with contradictions, as it is when talking about race and religion for peoples of color in the US in general. Religion within Asian American divides as it sustains, blinds as it nurtures. It can be conservatively hard-hearted as it is radically resistant. Religion oftentimes gets swept under the rug. From this perspective, there is certainly much to discuss, and I'm sure we will today. But I want to highlight a different type of lens today of how we might read Asian Americans as a type of New Testament, a type of sacred history in and of itself, one that gives voice, gives witness to defining stories, lessons, even parables gleaned from Asian American existence, that not simply document the past, but offer a prophetic path to the future. Our Sangha, our community, our peoplehood. So many of the best texts I find in Asian American studies functions in this mode. I recently talked about American Sutra by Duncan Williams. It's his tour de force about religion and Japanese American experience during the Second World War. Film, I would argue, is an even more powerful medium by which to communicate a history that is deeply felt and one that has reverberating effects. Beyond narrative, which is often the focus, film transports the viewer into a parallel reality and communicates on a number of levels. So avant-garde filmmaker Nathaniel Dorsky speaks about devotional cinema. In his articulation of the concept, Dorsky eschews a focus on narrative and instead focuses on lighting, shots and cuts, sound, and the way that the cinematic work provides a type of luminous quality. So if possible, I would appreciate it if Renee, if you could speak about your choices or actually your team's choices, because it was really a collaborative effort along these visual lines. For those of you who have seen Renee's other wonderful films, most notably My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha, you will notice that Asian Americans, the 5-part series, has a very different feel. And I know part of that is in part that it was a very collaborative effort. But I think there was a choice there of how to present it. The difference is visual tone and the difference in visual tone and presentation is palpable. And I would argue that our choices, your choices were meant to engage your audience in very different ways. So here, maybe to make it more specific, Renee, you know, I think that many of PBS documentaries actually do this type of devotional cinema. I think of Ken Burns, right? You know, the way he sets up his shots, the slow panning on black and white, the sepia tone. And sure, that's a devotional cinema. And there's almost like there's like a mold that a lot of PBS documentaries have to fit into. And I was wondering how you negotiated that choice. So I'm just gonna end by saying it's easy to categorize Asian Americans as a social documentary, a documentary history, but I feel it is much more than this. Like Lonnie Ding's ancestors, it pays homage. It upholds our civil religious belonging and collective humanity. One of the press releases mentions that the producers hope for an enlightening experience during COVID-19 crisis. I thought enlightening is a most apropos term. And like Rachel, it would be great if you could speak also about how this film is being viewed during this time, during the time of the pandemic crisis. I want to give a shout, I want to say thank you to Pan Autumn. I think this is a wonderful event and a great opportunity. And I want to give a shout out to Jane Hong. I believe she's one of the storytellers in Asian Americans. So Jane's with us today, so thank you.
Thank you, Jane. We would have added other Jane Hung, but we only had an hour and we were trying to figure out how to cram another anyway, but we're glad that Jane is here. And Helen, it's your turn.
Yeah, I echo Jane's thanks to Pan Autumn for inviting us to be here on this panel, and Renee, thanks so much for speaking with us today. And I will also just read from my notes here. Renee, I thought that, you know, hearing what you were saying about storytelling was so helpful, because that was what really stood out to me from the documentary, the power of storytelling, and also the historians, they're telling their own stories. So kind of in that vein, my comments are going to interweave some of my own anecdotal comments, and then alongside of history and religion. So finding a window into the past as a historian is intellectually gratifying work for me, but it rarely brings me to tears. But the PBS series on Asian American history was an exception. It brought me to tears several times. And I had to think about why that was the case. I binge watched it twice, and I thought about why there were moments where I was brought to tears. And so I have at least 3 reflections about that, and it'll interweave some of my thoughts about the religious and the study of religion. So first, it brought me back to the moment when I was first introduced to Asian American history. And that was half my life ago, when I was 18. And we were sitting in the Okada Tea House on Stanford's campus, and I was wondering aloud to a group of friends about my own struggles with my racial ethnic identity. Like, am I Korean? Am I American? Which one am I? How do I think about that? And Owen Lee, an Asian American activist and labor organizer who was a senior at the time, asked me, have you ever considered Asian American history? And that completely shocked me. I had never heard of such a thing. And it rocked my world, right? In the documentary, we're introduced to the Roots program, whose motto is no history, no self. And that resonated with what happened to me when I discovered Asian American history. I felt like I was finding myself anew. And Asian American history, therefore, itself is sacred work. And I think this really, just to underpin what Jane was just saying, it itself is sacred. And one might even call it a religious experience to encounter it. For me, it led to changing my major to comparative studies in race and ethnicity, and in part has really shaped my work as a historian today. It's kind of led to what I decided to do with my life. Second, the documentary reminded me of the pain of the LA riots with which my generation grew up. That's almost it's just a zinger, right? The white supremacist structures that pit Korean Americans and African Americans against each other, the human and material damage, as well as the trauma that still plagues us and also fuels a lot of our thirst for justice today. And it also reminded me that the first Asian American history paper I wrote that semester was on the LA riots. And so that also, it just conjured those memories up. And I remembered again Owen, who helped me write that paper. And I remember him, you know, we went to the library together, and he helped me select books, and we filled up a plastic bag full of books. And it just reminded me that we need personal guides and mentors in approaching this history. And so I don't know for other people, if you can think about those people who, you know, helped you really connect to this story. But I'm also really glad that this documentary is so accessible. It's going to be one of those guides for so many future students. So seeing the interview, especially with Angela O, reminded me of how when I was writing that first paper about the LA riots, I wanted to explore the role of religion in responding to the LA riots. Like, how did Angela O's Buddhist practice inform her social justice work post-LA riots? And how did Korean American immigrant congregations participate, if at all, in the justice work post-LA riots? These are kind of themes that just captured my brain. And that intersection between American religions and Asian American history is something that has just kind of fueled me along. And I feel like we're still trying to write those histories. And so that's also I think the documentary helped me reflect on my past, but also helped me think about the work that still needs to be done. Third, the historical content is rich and accessible. I really found the use of primary and secondary sources very informative, instructive. I'm going to actually point out specific scenes from the documentary to show students about how to do historical method when you're looking at the actual documents, letters, etc. But the documentary is also beautiful, shocking, and charming. It's artful. So I think that was another part that really moved me, is that this documentary is the intersection of history and art. It's just so moving in this particular medium. And I especially enjoyed the section on Japanese American internment and the way it was so artfully told through the transnational lens of interlocking oppressions between two empires, the US and Japan. I just thought that it was so smart. It worked on a way that was accessible, so new students can gravitate toward it, the stories, but it also took it to so many other levels analytically. It interweaves between micro, macro histories, getting us up close to the letters, pictures, video footage, oral histories of the Uno and An families. And I saw in the chat that a lot of people were interested in those family stories. And it also then pans back into the macro histories of clashing titans between the US and Japanese imperial expansion throughout Asia Pacific. And that kind of panning in, panning out, I thought was really gorgeous. In staying so close to the sources, and again, I love the use of so many different types of sources, and that's what I want to show my students. It explores the dilemmas of generational and familial tensions, national loyalties, the messy, constructed, absolutely constructed nature of race, ethnicity, gender, and explores also the ethical dimensions of treason, trauma, and empire. You know, you just see the subjects themselves grappling with the ethical dimensions of this past. The nuances between Japanese national, Japanese American, Korean national, Korean American identities between two empires was really captured nicely. And I think that's also what added to the nuance. It's just so many from different subjectivities. The angles are coming from different subjectivities. So, I mean, this is the kind of frame that I myself really desire to work in. So it was nice to see it visually framed in that way, to see that echoed back to me visually. And my hope is just to expand on these stories. My own contribution to, I hope, is to expand how we think about the religious dimensions of these Pacific crossings. And I hope that other people will also continue to write those stories. And that's my main question for today. And it echoes a lot of what Rachel was saying too, about, you know, how do we think about the centrality of the role of religion in Asian American history? What difference does it actually make? What's the right frame for telling Asian American religious history? For all those who are part of the American Academy of Religion, I mean, could you see a section, you know, on Asian American religious history? I mean, that could be something for our future. In closing, thanks for making this moving work of art and history that brought me to tears a few times. And it reconnected me to my own past with Asian American history, how I relate to it, and how I seek to continue to live and write it. Thank you.
So thank you, all three of you. That was really fabulous. And I want to give Renee a chance to respond, because you've all raised some amazing things around the documentary. But there's also been this amazing chat process happening, which we will preserve as we're recording this, and we will also preserve the chat so that everybody can, those of us who have been speaking didn't get to read every single comment. And I'm not sure how many Christine is going to be able to work into the rest of the time we have, but it just tells me that I think this is the first webinar in this series, not the last one. I think this is a conversation that we could continue in a rich way moving forward from just this as a sort of seed to new topics and things that come out of the chat. So don't worry, your chats won't get lost. We will be looking at them and thinking about how to plan another webinar to have a conversation to deepen the insights around this series. So Renee, I want to see if you have anything you'd like to say in response to what the three panelists said.
Okay, let me try to consolidate it a bit. So, I mean, I'm really happy for the critique as well as I'm especially happy for the compliments. That's not, but just the fact that people are thinking in terms of finding new kinds of threads from the content. I mean, for me, film is an entry point. It's not like the final, lid on the coffin of history. It's just, usually an emotional or personal and human kind of entry point for the audience to think critically about like whatever the themes are, or think about, the human dimension, and maybe they want to know more about the context and, the kind of like the social context, the political context. One of you mentioned that, why did it take so long? And we did try to do something like this over the decades. I mean, I wrote a treatment for an Asian American history series like about 25 years ago. And it takes so long because, the system, I mean, Asian Americans until very recently were pretty much invisible on screen. But it does, present this kind of burden of representation. So, the comments critical comments I've seen on my social media is one, why did you pack so much into just a few hours? And two, why did you miss, A through Z stories? I mean, I can give you a list of all those stories. I mean, which is why we really see this as all of us, again, as filmmakers, it's a part of a movement. So, one thing we want to do is tell people about the other stories that exist and encourage other stories. I mean, there were stories that, we had planned to shoot, like the Vietnamese shrimpers in the Gulf Coast who were attacked by the KKK. And then we found out Tim Tsai was doing the same film. And honestly, he's a younger filmmaker. We probably could have bogarted and just did it ourselves, but we thought, he's going to do this great film. He lives there in Texas. I mean, let's just find another story. But so those films, they exist out there. One thing that happened with Eyes on the Prize, if you take a lot of the stories in Eyes on the Prize, somebody ended up doing a feature-length film or an hour film. Stanley Nelson did a lot of those films. So we hope that it seeds, even new stories. So in terms of the question about the visual kind of choices we made, most of us, all of us, I would say, on the team as filmmakers, we would make films more in line with what somebody mentioned, episode 2 about the Japanese American incarceration. And it focused on one family, mostly the Uno family. That's because, when you focus like that and you have time to develop characters, filmically, it tends to be stronger. But, in terms of representation, we felt like we really had to try to get as many, different nationalities, as many different kinds of themes and moments of history in as possible. So you kind of make that sacrifice. So that in the World War II story in the 1930s, I was really interested, because I'm Japanese American. It's like, do I really want to revisit the incarceration story again? I mean, to me, I've lived with it my whole life. So I was really interested in how other Asian nationalities were, how they lived the World War II and the nuance there. And I think Grace and her team made a wise decision to really try to, in that episode, go deeper into those questions of loyalty and belonging, and also, how empire in this case, it was really the clash of empires what was shaping, you know, Asian American lives, and kind of focus in on it. And so visually, I mean, we did not, all of us as a team, we don't really like the kind of conventions of PBS historical documentaries where you have like a talking head and then you have a image. Somebody says, you know, bottle, then you see a bottle. We're more interested in visual storytelling. And I think we tried to bring that in, given the limitations of the medium, limitations of, you know, budget and time. I mean, this is a series. So in terms of the burden of representation, people have waited a long time for an Asian American series, you know, from our perspective, but in the world of, you know, this of television, it's just another TV show. It's just another TV show, had a short amount of time to produce, had a limited amount of money, and you have to just get out of the door, and you have to think about, you know, the ratings, like how are you going to get, one executive producer kept on saying, you know, well, Milton and Mildred is not going to like this. You know, they don't like to hear like racism or whatever. So we, you know, we had those voices in terms of like the Suits of, you know, how are we going to justify, you know, investing all this real estate of, you know, 5 hours of prime time and for our audience. But to me, it's like the PBS audience, it's like the Republicans. It's the not that they're Republican, they kind of trend, you know, center left maybe or central, but in that they have their core audience. It's mostly white, it's much older, and they don't want to lose that audience. But you know, you have all these new audiences out there. You have young people, you have people of color, you have all these. To me, it's like, let's try to, you know, develop those audiences. And those audiences are not going to just watch, you know, a talking head with pictures plugged in there. You know, people want a different kind of filmmaking. So, you know, as much as we could, we try to pursue that. I mean, that's one. Somebody also mentioned the Manila Men story. Actually, is a story that I told in My America or Honk of You Love Buddha in New Orleans and St. Bernard Parish. It's the family, the Burtnog family, these amazing sisters who can trace their lineage back to the Manila Men. But from the very beginning of conceptualizing the series, because it's television, I just wanted to start when there were pictures. And I didn't want to be panning across like paintings in museums. I wanted pictures, and I wanted to, as much as possible, to be able to find somebody who has a personal connection to these stories. So it's a sacrifice in terms of, you know, the historic kind of purity of the Asian American experience. But yeah, so we started, you know, late 1800s when there was even like some moving image footage, but you know, and most importantly, we were able to find people who were descendants or people who had some kind of emotional connection to the history and Asian American history. I mean, you can see just for us to lose like 2001 through the present. I mean, that's only, you know, not even 20 years, but it's a huge loss. So Asian American history is just so rich. I don't think there's, even if we only did 100 years and not 150 years, I think we would have been able to fill, like Grace Lee says, country music got 13 hours. We got 5 hours to tell 150 years of Asian American history. So yeah, I appreciate the notes about both the, you know, we try to kind of combine art with history. A lot of that was in, I mean, we had this amazing team of archival researchers. Somebody said we had like 20,000 images in the end. And, you know, those images have to be cleared and licensed, or you have to figure out if it's fair use. And then you multiply that by however many we ended up not being able to use. in the show, because we wanted images, you know, first that we had permission to use, but secondly, that kind of evoked these stories and these emotions and these themes all in, and, you know, the real estate, which I kind of look at a television hour as being real estate, it actually is very finite. Even a television hour is not 60 minutes. It's like 52 to 57 minutes, or in our case, to 54 minutes. So you know, your real estate is kind of shrunk. But and the other thing is about, you know, the images is Asian Americans were not pictured, or if we were pictured, you didn't like the picture. It was always, it was yellow face, or it was like, you know, racist picture. So we really had to work around that. And I'm not only talking about the bad old days. I mean, I've seen plenty of films, let's say about the Berkeley student strike or SF State. And I know that Asians were there because I know the people who were there, but you never see an Asian face. And I think, is it like they just didn't film them, or they just cut them out? So we had to like scour every single inch of footage to try to find Asian faces. And we had to look for alternative means. We have home movies in there. That's why, you know, Don's family home movies were such a, were like such a treasure to us. I want to say, and an interesting thing is, in episode 3 about the 1950s and 60s, one of our editors, Vic Chalk, who came on much later in the project, she wasn't there in the beginning, and she chose these 2 really beautiful shots of this little girl. One of a little girl is a home movie, and she's like dressed as an angel, and then the second is this close-up of a little girl smiling into the camera, but she kind of has this attitude. It's the very last frame of episode 3. It kind of like, you know, is the shot that, you know, just brings everything together. And we found out last week through the family, those were both Don Mabalan as a child, the angel, and that last shot. So that's, you know, the home movies, we film ourselves. I mean, we've always like, we found home movies through the Japanese American National Museum from the 1920s and the 1930s. We also had to find, because sometimes Asian Americans were pictured but not indexed in the archive. So for example, we knew that Patsy Mink from newspaper accounts had, in 1960 at the Democratic National Convention, had come out of the blue before she was elected to Congress. And she gave this really important landmark speech in support of urging the delegates and convincing the delegates to stand firm on civil rights. So we knew she gave that speech. We couldn't find it anywhere, you know, and we did all these searches in the network news on people who had, you know, documented the convention, because they were all on television. And then, you know, I said at one point, you know, and because I've learned this over the years, look for like the white people who are making speeches in the same day, and just look at their footage, and but look at all the outs and the in-betweens, and maybe we'll find Patsy. And, you know, they found Patsy's speech that way. So it's, yeah, so for, you know, picturing Asian Americans, it was really important for us to also make the series like this gathering of the visible evidence that we were here. The other thing we did was we had in that second episode, the Uno family, we just needed we wanted the testimony of Kay Uno, one of the siblings who testified at the Chicago's redress and reparation hearings. And we found out like last summer from Ryan Yokota, a historian, that somebody had found in a closet over 60 videotapes of those hearings. And, you know, sitting in a closet, it could have been like completely disintegrated. And we said, I mean, Kay's one thing, but we got to just get the whole thing preserved. So, excuse me. So and they were in Chicago, they were going to try to raise money and to do it. And we thought, you know, that's going to take forever. So we got the whole thing preserved and digitized, and a lot of that, you know, like the home movies, you know, they were, I mean, to digitize them in 4K means that, you know, it's going to be around a lot longer. We learned that lesson from, you know, the Museum of Chinese Americans in New York. It was in February, you know, so much of the archives was burnt down without being digitized. So we, you know, in the series, we really learned that we have this opportunity to make sure these things are, you know, that when the new filmmakers, you know, take up these stories, that they have material that they can use. Sorry, I rambled.
Thank
but,
you.
You know,
I mean,
that's a filmmaker thing.
I hear from you. So this is really fabulous. And as I said, Christine's been keeping track of the chat, and so we will use what she's been looking at to plan another webinar, because there is a lot more to say about even each of the episodes and the questions they raise. So I want to thank all of our panelists, and especially Renee, for giving us this time to have this conversation, and hope to welcome you back at the next one. And if you did register for this, you will find out when the next one will be. So I hope you come back, and we want to continue these conversations. But for now, we need to end this one because we're out of time. So thank you, everyone, and have a good week.